Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Colvin, the Public Programs Curator at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, and I want to welcome you to this virtual Food for Thought program. This month, we are commemorating 100 years of women's suffrage. Now, you're going to hear a little bit more about the history of the women's suffrage movement when the program begins, but if you're interested in learning more about the movement, Alabama women, or virtual events around the commemoration, visit alabamawomen100.org. And join us next month for our Food for Thought when Archives Curator Ryan Barker will present on the other perspective of the women's suffrage movement, anti-suffragists. During the program, if you have questions for Dr. Burns, type them into the comment box. We'll be able to have a live Q&A after her talk. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Valerie Pope Burns. Dr. Burns is an associate professor of history at the University of West Alabama. She is a past president of the Alabama Historical Association and has researched and presented on the suffrage movement in Alabama. She is also the author of the Encyclopedia of Alabama article on the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. Today, she will present Will Alabama Move for Suffrage? And I would like to welcome Dr. Burns.
Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Alex, and thank you to the Alabama Department of Archives and History for hosting this program today on this Facebook. And this is the perfect week to do this. So just 2 days ago, celebrated the 100th anniversary of Tennessee becoming the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And if you want a great story about how one vote really does make a difference, look up the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature in 1920, a guy named Harry Byrne, who was the deciding factor in making Tennessee the 36th state, thanks to a letter from his mother. So that's a great story. And on the 26th of this month, so next week, the Congress declared the 19th Amendment officially ratified. So we're right in the middle of kind of a week of centennial celebrations. I know we had a lot of great events scheduled for this week throughout the state and throughout the country, and unfortunately, because of coronavirus, a lot of those have been canceled. But I'm so thankful to the archives for making this presentation possible. So I mentioned 1890 as our start date for this. That is because that is the year the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association joined together to form NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, to really start to work for a constitutional amendment. The movement itself in Alabama really gets started in 1892 when we have the formation of our first suffrage club. And so the way I'm going to do this talk, I'm going to break it up into 3 parts. The first part, we're just going to talk about kind of what was going on in 1890 and 1892 and why did women need to fight for the right to vote. We're going to talk about a woman named Frances Griffin. Then there's a bridge. The movement sort of dies down a little bit in Alabama in 1905. It's going to pick up again about 1910. And then from about 1915 forward to 1920, we're going to talk about a woman named Patty Ruffner Jacobs and the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. But in between that, we're going to talk about a woman named Adela Hunt Logan at Tuskegee, African-American woman. And she was really bridging the gap in there with her work. So those are the 3 main. We'll focus on the movement in Alabama through those 3 women. But just to give you an idea of what life was like if you were a woman living in really the United States as a whole, but in this case, particularly Alabama in 1890, you had no rights. So you could be sued, but you couldn't bring suit in court. Your weight didn't carry as much, your testimony didn't carry as much weight in a court of law as a man's would. And in some places, especially prior to the Civil War, but even into the second half of the 19th century, if your husband passed away, even though you're still alive, your children could be considered wards of the state, and you would actually have to petition the state for custody of your children as a woman because you did not exist. The common phrase was, women, children, and the mentally insane. Okay, and that's how they grouped everybody together. It was men, and then it was women and children and the mentally insane. So That's where they saw women as far as their intellectual level. Women had no property rights until about the mid 1800s. And one of the first rights under the law that women got was to actually be able to keep property they inherited and brought into a marriage. And you might be thinking, oh, this is great. This is a great step for women, and rights and having rights. But no, I mean, it was great they got to keep their property. But the reason the state did that is what was happening was women were bringing property into a marriage. It could be real estate, it could be money, it could be, up until the Civil War, enslaved people. And what was happening was the husbands would make bad business decisions, they would gamble, and they would lose their wife's property. And then the family would be plunged into poverty, and they would become, the responsibility of the state. And so what the state decided was women tend to do a better job of holding on to their own property than men would, and are doing. So why don't we let women keep their property, because that way they won't become impoverished and the state won't have to deal with them. Okay, so that was actually one of the first rights that women had, was the right to keep property they brought into a marriage, but it was so they wouldn't become the responsibility of the state when their husbands lost their property. And in some places, women could vote locally. Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1872. That's in local elections. But women did not have the right to vote for the most part. Occasionally, they would get the right to vote for school board members. And that makes sense because that's, that deals with children, right? So women should have a say in that. But it was real hit or miss. There was nothing statewide, much less national, as far as women having any set right to vote. And of course, the biggest kicker of it all was women had to pay taxes, but they had no say in how the tax laws were written, because they couldn't elect the officials writing the law. And so women said, you know what, you're doing taxation without representation. Didn't we fight a war over this against Britain? This is why we got our freedom in the first place. We wanted a say in how Britain was taxing us. But yet women still have no say in the tax laws that are written that affect them. So, it's kind of a case, if it was good enough to create a country out of it, surely it's good enough to give half that country the right to vote. So those were the arguments that women tended to make, okay? And then she also says that regarding the consent of the governed. Now, this comes from a speech by a woman named Frances Griffin, who we're fixing to talk about. And she gives us fantastic a speech in 1901 to the Alabama State Constitutional Convention. And she says, regarding the consent in the government, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now comes the declaration that women as well as men belong to the governed. And upon that belief, I ground my demand to the application of the principle to citizens regardless of sex. Okay, that's how she starts her speech. And then it just gets fantastic from there. So we'll be talking about that in just a minute. All right, so how did these women actually become involved in suffrage and work for it? Almost to a letter, every single woman that got involved in suffrage started off in some other what today we would call some other social justice movement. Okay, so women's first foray into public movements was missionary societies through their churches, and that was appropriate, right? It was religious. The women met in groups, and they learned how to govern themselves. So elect, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. They learned how to run an organization basically through these missionary societies, but nobody questioned that because, it's religious. Women can do that, and that's great. The first nationwide reform organization was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which advocated for the end of the consumption of alcohol. And they get started in 1874. Frances Griffin, who I've mentioned already, and we're going to talk about some more. This is how she gets into suffrage. She starts off in temperance. The idea being when men especially drink too much, one, they're drinking away money that could buy food and clothes for their children. They come home and abuse is going to be a problem. So you have starving, abused children who are freezing to death. Okay. So we need to end the consumption of alcohol. Women saw a lot of society's ills starting with alcohol abuse. Okay. Another line that gets women into the suffrage movement is child labor. So Jane Addams, if you're familiar with her, with Whole House in Chicago, she is the sort of national voice for ending child labor. And in Alabama, that's going to be Patty Ruffner Jacobs, who I mentioned, and she's going to be in the last third of our discussion today. They are working against factory and mining conditions because children can start working as young as 5 years old. Okay, in a textile mill, in a steel mill, and in a coal mine. And if you start working in a coal mine or a textile mill at 5 years old, you're twice as likely to be dead by the age of 20 as your counterpart working on a farm. Okay. And so they are going to fight against that. Okay. First, we need to raise the age. Second of all, we need to change the conditions. Okay, so children are getting their hands cut off, their fingers cut off, they're getting run over by carts in the mines, all these awful conditions. Work week is 6 days a week. The only day they have off is Sunday. That's why Sunday school started. It was the only time they could learn the basics. And then they worked, of course, 10 hours a day. So they're working all the time, and it's literally killing them. And what's interesting about Patty Ruffner Jacobs, her husband owns a slag company. So I'm sure their dinner conversations were interesting because they're actually having, she's fighting against child labor, and he's probably got some child labor working in his factory. So that's kind of, that one's kind of interesting. So, all righty. So here's the early movement and Miss Frances Griffin. And I will say, she's kind of my favorite out of the three women I'm going to talk about today because she's smart and she's witty and she's got a good sharp tongue on her and she knows what she's doing. So she is from Wetumpka. She attended the Judson Female Institute, and which of course is today Judson College. And for full disclosure, I'm a Judson girl also. So that might be one reason I feel especially close to her. She graduates from Judson at the age of 17 in 1860. And of course, we all know that by 1861, we're involved in the Civil War. And a good number of the men who were probably eligible for her to marry are killed in the Civil War. And so she never does marry. She gets a job. She becomes a teacher. So, and that's acceptable, right? That's a woman's place of dealing with children. But it gets her up in front of people and it gets her seeing the conditions of her students coming in and all the various conditions they're living in. Okay. And she's having to fight to keep kids out of the textile mills, to keep them in school. Okay. Too. So she's seeing that. But she gets started in temperance. And in 1889, she goes and speaks at the National Convention for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She developed sort of this cult following for her speeches. And like I said, she's very witty and she's invited to speak all over the country for temperance. She speaks to the Texas legislature about getting temperance, what becomes prohibition, put into their K through 12 curriculum as part of their schools. A legislator was asked by a reporter about it, and he said, well, these things come in threes, and in 1 week we had a tornado, a hurricane, and Frances Griffin, right? So she commanded a room when she walked into a room. And then she ends up realizing, you know what? We can fight all day to end the consumption of alcohol. We can fight all day to better the lives of women and children. But until we can pass laws to stop the problems before they start, okay, we're actually just going to be fighting an uphill battle. We're going to keep pushing that rock uphill. And instead of having to clean up after the damage has been done, why don't we stop the problem in the first place? Okay, and so she decides we need the right to vote so we can elect officials who will pass laws that stop these problems before they start. Because right now, what women were doing at this point was they were just playing clean up. They were cleaning up the messes caused by basically these bad policies allowed or put forth by men. And she says, so we need to stop it before it starts. So that's why we need to be able to vote. Okay. So in 1892, she forms the first state suffrage association in Alabama. By 1889, she's speaking at the NAWSA convention in Grand Rapids. Her speeches actually are talked about in national newspapers. Okay, how very well they're received, how very intelligent she is, how very witty she is. So she, like I said, she sort of gets this following. Frances Griffin's going to speak. We want to definitely go hear that. And then in 1901, she has sort of her coup, and that is she goes and addresses the 1901 Constitutional Convention in Montgomery, okay, to try to get the men at the Constitutional Convention to give women the right to vote in Alabama. The men start their work day that day at 12. They adjourn at 12:50, so they worked a sum total of 50 minutes, right? That's a good job if you can keep it, right? So she worked some total of 50 minutes. They do. Then they have to suspend the meeting to allow her to talk, to speak, to address them, and they have to suspend the rules. And it's kind of funny. So they vote to do that, and several men voted no. Well, Griffin had found out, she speaks on a Monday, and she had found out the Friday before that she was going to be allowed to speak. And so she sends out the word. Now, remember, this is 1901. This is prior to, obviously, internet, no TV, no radio. Okay. But word gets out, Frances Griffin's going to speak, and the gallery is packed. Okay, with women who have come to hear Frances Griffin speak. So when they're having the vote to suspend the rules to allow her to address the convention, several men in a voice vote say no. But when it comes time to do a show of hands, only one man, a guy from Selma, actually, is brave enough to actually raise his hand and say no. And so John Knox, the leader of the convention, makes that gentleman from Selma escort Frances Griffin to his desk, to John Knox's desk. She is not allowed to address the body from the actual podium where everybody else has been speaking. She has to go address the body from next to the speaker's desk, John Knox's desk. Okay, but she does this great speech. It's the only speech of hers that we actually have recorded. We have a full transcript of it. It's in the minutes of the Constitutional Convention. If you want to see that, you can find those online. And it's just phenomenal. It's worth reading the whole thing. But she takes down every single argument against women having the right to vote. And we're going to look at those in just a second. She goes on after this speech. And by the way, no surprise here, they do not give women the right to vote in the 1901 Constitution. But she does go on after that and found the Women's Suffrage Association for the state. She's president in 1903, 1904. And by 1905, she's tired. And so she sort of steps back and lets some other women take over. But she does continue to attend events and things once the movement gets revived around 1910. Okay, so here are the reasons that men and a lot of women thought women should not vote. And again, as Alex mentioned, if you want to learn more about the anti-suffragists, please tune into Ryan Robbins Walker's talk on September 17th on the same platform. And I know it's eye-opening. It's very, very interesting to read. But anyway, here's some reasons women should not have the vote. And then here's the reply in that 1901 Constitutional Convention speech from Frances Griffin. Okay, the idea that women have silent influence. They influence their husbands, they influence their fathers, they influence their sons, and therefore, when their husbands and fathers and sons go to vote, they will represent them. Now, I don't know about y'all. My husband and I agree on a lot of things, but there's a lot of things we don't. And I don't know that he could adequately represent me, right, when in my views when he went to vote, because most of the time what the men are going to do, understandably, is vote how they feel. Okay, so she says this idea that women have silent influence. She said, did you ever hear of a man who wanted to be disfranchised in order to increase his influence? I have found that silent influence is a little too silent in the ears of the legislator. Okay, she said this is a joke. This doesn't work at all. The idea that politics is too corrupt for women and it will sully women. She said government is made up of four parts. the state, the society, the church, and the home. She said, as far as society, church, and the home are concerned, women have been involved in those, and those are great. As far as the state is concerned, it's corrupt, but it's only because women have been kept out of it. Okay. She says politics is corrupt because you've kept women out of it. You need to bring women in. Women clean up things. Let them come clean up politics. And then she goes on at the end, she says, women have a trust in religion and no politics, while men have a trust in politics. And judging by the state of public affairs, no religion to speak of. Okay. If you want to purify politics, consolidate the truest in religion with the truest in politics and let women participate. Okay. The idea that women aren't smart enough to vote, she comes armed with statistics on this one, and she says there are more women in college in 1901, and which is also true, by the way, in 2020, than there are men in college, and the numbers are ever increasing. Okay. And she says, and on top of that, add to these numbers the temperate lives as a rule, which must be that women live. They neither steep themselves in tobacco nor besot themselves with liquor, so that whatever brains they have are kept intact. Okay. Like I said, she's very sharp-tongued, and she doesn't mind throwing some barbs at them. Then the idea that women can't fight for their freedoms, and so therefore they shouldn't have a say in them. She says, you know what? No. If you look back, now remember, so this is 1901. All these people who are at this 1901 Constitutional Convention, they either lived through the Civil War or through Reconstruction. Okay, either they fought or their fathers fought. So the Civil War is fresh on their minds. Okay, and so she says, if you look back at the Civil War, who did not fight in the Civil War? Lawyers, politicians, teachers, businessmen, okay, because they weren't physically fit to fight. Who did fight? Mine workers, mill workers, farmers, okay? She says, so, you know, what she's basically saying is all those men there for the Constitutional Convention, they wouldn't have been eligible to fight either. She said, so if you're going to take away the right to vote based on who's eligible to fight, guess what? None of y'all are eligible to fight. Okay, so she completely disbunks that idea. The idea that politics is a burden for women, she says, no, the cleanup from your bad policies, that's the burden for women. If you want to lighten our load, let us vote, have a say in the laws, and clean up society before the problems start. And then the idea that not every woman wants to vote. She said not every man wants to vote, but men still get to vote. So that doesn't hold water either. And then the last thing, and this is the most damning indictment that she makes in the whole talk. And she ends her speech with this. She says, you know what, we've talked before about the idea that men can speak for women, which they can't. She said, but let me give you an example. She said, I'm single. My father's dead. I have no brothers. I have no sons. I live at home with my sisters who are widowed and their small children. The only man in our lives is our 22-year-old gardener, who's African American. She uses Negro, but her black gardener is the only man in their lives. He's eligible to vote. He has a third-grade education. She said, so he goes to the poll and votes, and he's going to represent Griffin herself, right, who has a college education, and the sisters and her nieces. Okay, and she said, that doesn't work. Okay, he's going to have a different set of policies that he's interested in than I am. And she said, and on top of that, and this is where she really calls him out on it, she says basically the whole reason y'all are calling this 1901 Constitutional Convention is to disfranchise African American voters. So you're going to disfranchise my gardener with this Constitutional Convention, with this Constitution, and then who's going to represent me? She said, absolutely nobody. Okay. Now, there was one bright spot. They did not give women the right to vote, obviously, through the Constitutional Convention. But there is one bright spot in this convention, and it's this man named Benjamin Craig of Dallas County. Benjamin Craig, God love him, he put forth so many amendments trying to get women the right to vote. Okay. So many amendments, in fact, there was a legislator from Calhoun County who in jest, put forth a motion asking the gentleman from Dallas County to quit putting forth suffrage amendments for women. He was successful in August of 1901 of getting a bill passed to allow women to vote on municipal taxes. Okay, no taxation without representation, right? And so he says he gets this passed, and women get the right to vote on municipal taxes for one day. The next day they come back and somebody else put forth a vote to rescind that decision, and it was passed. So there was one day in 1901 where women had the right to vote on municipal taxes, and then that died. And so with the 1901 Constitutional Convention, there goes the hopes of women up until what's going to end up turning out to be originally next 1915. Okay. So by this point, Frances Griffin, God love her, she's tired. About 1905, she just sort of backs away from everything. And then we do have other women working, and Adela Hunt Logan is one of those. In 1883, she moves to Tuskegee to become the first librarian there. She was born in 1863. Her father was white. Her mother was black. Her father had paid for her to be educated. She attends the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention in Atlanta in 1895, and she has to pass to do that. But she's embraced by the suffrage movement. She writes letters for the Crisis, which is the journal of the NAACP. She writes letters for Woman's Journal. She writes letters for Colored Americans. She's writing letters for NAWSA pamphlets, okay, and articles for those. She's actually scheduled to speak at, I think it was the 1901 NAWSA convention, National Convention. And then Susan B. Anthony found out she was actually African American and had her invitation to that rescinded. Okay, so, and that is the unfortunate aspect of a lot of the suffrage movement in the South, especially prior to 1920. A lot of times you have white women saying, if you will let white women have the right to vote, we will counteract any African Americans who are still voting. Okay, now after 1901 in Alabama, there's not going to be many, but racism, unfortunately, is definitely a part of the suffrage movement on the part of white women working for suffrage. Hunt Logan is a part of the Tuskegee Women's Club, and the Women's Club movement for the African American community was very, very important. It had a huge impact. There are women's clubs, both white and black, again, working to solve social ills, but again, they are segregated. What was great about Logan is she consistently said over and over, race had nothing to do with her suffrage work. Okay, she wanted all women to have the right to vote. And in that aspect, she was very much ahead of a lot of the white women working for suffrage in the South. Okay. Unfortunately, at home, things were a little more difficult. Griffin had no husband to sort of keep her home. She had no children to keep her home. Logan was married with 6 children. She's also working. Okay, she's a librarian, so she's doing that double day. She's working, she's got a family at home, she's trying to do club work and suffrage work and all this kind of thing. And it eventually takes a toll on her. And her husband actually sends her to Michigan to a sanatorium. She spends several years up there, actually. Different people, family members help with her children. But she finds out in 1915 that Booker T. Washington is ill. She had been hired by Washington. She really saw him as a father figure to her. And so she checks herself out. She gets on a train, comes home from Michigan. She gets to the train station in Tuskegee, and she's met with the news. Your husband's been unfaithful. There's been a lot of affairs and things. And so shortly after that, Booker T. Washington passes away. And then on December 12th, 1915, which was the day that Washington was buried, Logan actually goes up to, I believe, the second floor window of the administration building where she worked, and she commits suicide because she's having to work the double day, which a lot of women were having to do. But on top of that, she also has the layer of dealing with the infidelity of her husband and the death of Washington and having to pass. She's trying to have to pass in a white woman's world. I mean, she's being rejected by white women working for some of the same things that she's working for. And it's very, very emotionally and mentally difficult for her. But if you'd like to learn more about her, her granddaughter, Adele Logan Alexander, has written a book, and the information is on the bottom, Princess of the Hither Isles, a Black suffragist story from the Jim Crow South, published by Yale University, I think in 2018. So it's a fairly recent book, and that's a very good read. And I do recommend that to you. All right. So she's working up until obviously about 1912 for suffrage. And then we're going to get into the second wave in Alabama with Patty Ruffner Jacobs, who I mentioned earlier. She's in the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. She's also, there's an Encyclopedia of Alabama article about her as well. And there's one coming out about Griffin, and there's also one about Logan also. So you can find more information on these women online. And if you're not familiar with the Encyclopedia of Alabama, definitely take a look. It's a fantastic resource, and we're very, very lucky to have that. So anyway, she's born in 1875. So she's born about the time the WCTU, right, and Francis Griffin are really getting started. So she's, like I said, she's kind of the next generation. She comes to suffrage through the child welfare movement. And she originally, around 1910, founds the Birmingham Equal Suffrage Association. In 1912, she and some ladies from Selma, and Selma and Birmingham, they were the hot spots for the suffrage movement in Alabama, especially Selma. They were doing suffrage, back in the early 1900s. They joined together. They meet in Birmingham. They joined together, and they found the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association in October of 1912. And there is an article about that on the Encyclopedia of Alabama website as well. She's later on going to go serve on the NAWSA board, the National Women's Suffrage Association board. In 1920, that's going to change over to the League of Women Voters, and she serves on that national board as well. She's later on appointed by Roosevelt to serve on a consumer advisory board, and then the TVA. And she passes away at the age of 60. And in 1935, at home, she was fine, and apparently they think she had a heart attack. So, but again, remember, her husband owns a slag mill in Birmingham, and so I'm sure they had some very interesting discussions about child welfare, because she's trying to end bad, practices within the factory setting. Okay, and that's how she gets involved in suffrage. Okay, so what did the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association do? The Selma group had formed one of the founders had also formed the library there. They're working for child welfare in factories too, and alcohol consumption. Of course, there's the AESA. They do newspaper columns throughout the state. They travel throughout the state and set up other chapters. This was scandalous. Okay, now the reason Griffin and Jacobs are able to do as much work as they do is because Griffin, of course, doesn't have children. Jacobs has 2 daughters, but she also has housekeepers, right? She has people to keep her children. Okay, the white movement in Alabama is very much an upper class movement, because they're the women who can afford to hire other people to do their daily work so that they have time to go do this. They also have the means to travel. They traveled by train. They drove themselves. And y'all, there were some horrible things said about these women because they were getting in a car and driving themselves places. So that was a big deal. They were driving themselves places. They were traveling by train alone. And they were giving public speeches, which apparently, God forbid, okay, it was just a horrible, horrible thing. So, but, they did it because it's what had to be done. So in 1913, they're on a train. The conductor is a man named Joseph Green from Dallas County, and he is a representative in the state legislature from Dallas County. And they convinced Joseph Green to sponsor a suffrage bill in the Alabama legislature when the legislature met in 1915. And Green agrees to do it. So in January of 1915, it's brought before a subcommittee. It passes out of subcommittee and goes up for a vote. Now, these things usually tend to do pretty well when the sponsor of the bill actually supports his own bill. Somebody must have gotten a hold of Greene, and the best we can figure is they told Joseph Greene, if you continue to sponsor suffrage, giving women the right to vote, it's going to ruin your political career. And so when it comes time for Greene to get up to give a speech about the bill, he speaks against his own bill. Okay. And it would have been a hard obstacle to overcome for women anyway, because even if they had given, they put it on a ballot. Well, first of all, the legislature, right, is all men. So the women are across the board completely dependent on men to give them the right to vote. So they've got to get all men in the legislature to vote to give women the right to vote, to put it on a ballot. And then when it goes out to the ballot, they're dependent on the men of the state of Alabama to vote to give them the right to vote. And so obviously when Greene speaks against his own bill, it doesn't pass. Joseph Greene gets the nickname the Dallas County Acrobat because he flip-flopped on the issue. Okay, and so women realize they're going to have to wait a few more years for the legislature to meet again. And in the meantime, the 19th Amendment shows up. Okay, and so the Alabama gets the 19th Amendment in June of 1919, I believe. And they are really the first Southern state to address the issue. And so the big debate came, will Alabama break the solid South for suffrage? Okay. Will Alabama be the one to sort of be on the forward end of this and give women in Alabama and the country, right, the right to vote by looking at the 19th Amendment? Okay. And so they do allow a woman, Mrs. J.B. Park from Selma, to give a speech. Again, the gallery's packed with women. If you were for suffrage, you wore a yellow rose. If you're against suffrage, you wore a red rose. So the gallery's packed with women wearing yellow roses, yellow sashes. Okay. Mrs. J.B. Park from Selma gives a vote. They had signed petitions. There were petitions with thousands and thousands of signatures on them saying, please pass the 19th Amendment. And Mrs. Park said, we feel we are your equals and we want our right to vote to count at the polls. Women have been too long treated as irresponsible children, and now they want to share in the things that are going on. After her speech, the vote in the House was 60-31 against ratification of the 19th Amendment. The vote in the Senate was 19-13 against ratification. Okay, and so it's going to become, the women of Alabama at this point are going to just have to wait on legislators in other states to give them the right to vote. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, Tennessee does that in 1920, August 18th, 1920, and with Harry Byrne. The kind of real quick of that is he's wearing a red rose. It's a tie vote, 48-48. He's the youngest member of the legislature. He's the last one to vote. He kept trying to get him to table it because he didn't want to vote. But finally, when it came time for him to vote, he changed his vote away from his red rose and voted in favor of the 19th Amendment. And when asked why, he'd gotten a letter from his mother. And he said, a boy knows that the best thing to do is follow the advice of your mother. So he voted for the 19th Amendment. So Alabama was dependent on these other men. But once they got the right to vote, the women of Alabama did not let it go to waste. And in 1922, they elected the first woman to the state legislature. And of course, Selma again, right? Selma shows up a lot. Hattie Hooker Wilkins from Selma was elected to the House of Representatives. She served one term in 1922. But in the irony of ironies, and in sort of, if you believe in karma, in her bid to win the legislative seat for Selma, she beat the Dallas County Acrobat, Joseph Greene. And so whoever had advised Greene that voting for suffrage or pushing suffrage would ruin his career. Actually, the reverse was true. Voting against suffrage is what ultimately ended his political career. So that ends our talk, and I will open it up now for questions.
Hello, Valerie. Excellent. Thank you so much for that talk. And just like Dr. Burns said, if you have any questions, put them in the comment box and we'll be able to share them. But I know I have a few that I'd like to ask just to start off, kind of get the ball rolling.
Yeah.
So ratification happens, right? And it passes. What is the kind of process of then women getting the vote in Alabama? Is it a long process to be able to kind of start getting that vote? What do they have to do? And how did the women of Alabama react to the ratification of the 19th Amendment?
Well, the first caveat of that is obviously, are you a white woman or are you a black woman? And so if you're white, it's a fairly simple process. It's not much different than it is today. Well, actually, yeah, it is. let me backtrack that. You would have to do a literacy test. Okay, you had to prove you could read. You had to, in some cases, do an understanding clause, and of course, you had to pay a poll tax, right? But otherwise, I mean, you showed up. You had to show proof of residency, which you still have to do that today. But you had to have lived in the city a certain amount of time, the county a certain amount of time, to be able to register to vote. So those were the main things. You had the tests, so to speak, to be able to vote. And obviously, if you're African American, it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, if you can read, then they say you don't pass the understanding clause. The understanding clause was very subjective. They would give you a copy of an amendment from the Constitution and say interpret it, and you could interpret it correctly, and they'd say you didn't. Okay. Now, I had somebody ask me a very good question when I gave this talk earlier, and they said, "Well, why does the 19th Amendment matter to Black women if it didn't really give them the right to vote in 1920?" And I said, "Well, because when you get the Civil Rights Act of 64, and then especially the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if the 19th Amendment hadn't been in place, African American women still wouldn't have been able to vote. So it has to be there, you know, to make 1965 give full voting rights to men and women. Just unfortunately, African American women had to wait 45 years for that. So, and that's unfortunate. So, and yeah, women did register to vote. Obviously, you've got enough women, for instance, in Dallas County registering to vote to elect a woman to the legislature. It was kind of hit or miss. I think there's more registration in urban areas compared to rural areas. But most of that has to do with access, right? You're not doing anything online at all for any of this. When you had to go in person, and for farming families who only come to town on Saturday's not an option. And then another obstacle would be a lot of times these voting registration boards, you actually had to go before a board, and they only met sometimes 3 days a month. So it's real hit or miss. It kind of just depends on where you are and what type of access you have. But women did vote, and they did get out and vote. And even, you know, when elections roll around, and this week I've seen people and they're posting pictures of their great grandmother's voter registration card for 1920, you know, or the first time she goes to vote in 21, or when she's paying a poll tax in 25 or something like that. So women did it, and obviously it was important enough to them that they kept those first sort of mementos of their right to vote. So obviously there were a lot of women who realized this is a big deal. This is important. And it was funny, is so many times those voter registration cards from the 20s were stuck in the family Bible.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, like, I mean, that's where you keep the important stuff, right? Births, marriages, you know, deaths, and that kind of thing, and your voter registration. So I don't know anybody who even knows where their voter registration card hardly is today. But in 1920 and 21, 22, they were proud of it and they kept it. So there were enough women who realized, you know, the importance of that.
It was a big deal, and it was a moment for them.
Yeah.
We do have a question from one of our viewers right now, so I'll show it here. Were there any of these women suffragists involved in trying to get African Americans the right to vote? So after, either during the movement or after, is there any evidence that maybe some of these suffragists were trying to work to get African American women included in it later?
Well, of course, Logan, obviously Adela Hunt Logan, and then of course she unfortunately passes away in 15. So that's she's out of the picture. There are other African American women working for the right to vote, but no, unfortunately, it's very segregated. And even after 1920, if you do have women going out and registering other women to vote, they're not crossing racial lines. White women are not trying to get African American women registered to vote. They're even in some places by like the 50s and 60s, if you're African American and you wanted to register to vote, you actually had to have a registered voter speak for you to sort of like sign off, like, yeah, I think this person's eligible to vote. And I have seen evidence of white men standing for Black men to be able to register to vote. I have never seen any voter registration cards or comments or minutes or anything where a white woman did so. Now, that may have been, honestly, because it might not have carried as much weight. I mean, even by the 1950s, women can't serve on juries. So there's still problems with women and representation in the law, regardless of race. But I've never seen, I have not seen any evidence, for instance, of white women specifically trying to bring Black women in to be able to vote. They're not included in that suffrage work prior to 1920 in the South, and they're not going out, reaching out to Black women to be able to register to vote once women can vote. We have a tendency, unfortunately, in the U.S. to classify ourselves by race, class, and gender in that order. And so, what I tell women all the time is we make up 51% of the population. Like we could rule the world if we could get over these other things that divide us first. Okay. And unfortunately, we tend to see ourselves by our race first instead of as women. So, and that was the case even then. Women would have had a huge voting block if they had been able, to get each other, to get past the racial barrier to vote, but they really didn't, unfortunately.
Yeah, I will say, whenever I'm kind of discussing, I always say a lot of these suffragists had great ideas for gender equality, but not necessarily for racial equality. And so you see that in their arguments too. They frequently prop up with these great arguments about how women are equal to men, but then they will make the same argument that race divides us. You know, so it's kind of it's a hard way to kind of think through it, and it kind of brings to the question: how should we be commemorating the 19th Amendment in Alabama? Is this a moment of celebration? How should we really? What should we focus on in this? We're talking about the 19th Amendment this week, this year. What really should our role as historians be in trying to understand this movement?
We just have to be honest about it. I mean, it's very important, right? Because it does give half the population, regardless of race, the right to vote. But just like everything else, it's done by people, and people aren't perfect. And it's like every other historical everything. We have to acknowledge the good and the warts, okay, that go with it. And unfortunately, the racial divide is one of the downsides to the fight for the 19th Amendment. It doesn't lessen the 19th Amendment because, fortunately, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they finally did a stronger job of taking race out of the equation. I mean, I know the 15th Amendment was already there for men, but we know with all these other obstacles in the way to voting, right? And finally, in 65, they do a better job with the Department of Justice of saying, and the thing I love about, there's a great book, if anybody's interested in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there's a book, the guy's name is Brian Landsberg. He actually worked for the Department of Justice, and he had been sent into Alabama to find out how African Americans were being kept from voting. And what he found, he went to Perry County, he went to Sumter County. I've lived in both places, so I'm very familiar with those, and some other counties. Elmore maybe was one of them. And basically everything that showed up in the 1965 Voting Rights Act of you can't do this, 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 and this, it's because that's what they were doing in Perry County and Sumter County and places like that, to keep African Americans from voting. So finally, after 1965, we get a much more concrete set of rules for allowing people to vote. And so that's, again, for African Americans, that's where the 19th Amendment comes in finally for women, is if the 19th Amendment's not there, then African American women still wouldn't have been voting, regardless of what happened in 1965. So, we have to talk about it. We have to be honest about it. There's no point. It's unfortunate. I don't think it lessens the impact of the 19th Amendment, because, again, like I said, you do now have 50% more of your population voting, or at least eligible to vote, which is huge. I mean, that's so important. So we just have to we have to recognize it's not perfect. Or the amendment was fine. There's nothing wrong with the wording of the amendment. Society, right, managed to kind of circumvent some parts of it. So the movement itself wasn't perfect. The amendment's fine. We just have to acknowledge it, but it is important, and we have to appreciate what all these women were doing, because, like I said, they were to us today, it's no problem. I can give a talk in public. I don't think anything about it. I drive myself all over the place, and don't think anything about it. It's really, really hard for us to wrap our heads around what these women were doing and how big of a deal that it was for both Black and white women both to really be pushing against. And it's a double barrier for Black women, because they're having to push against racial barriers and gender or sex barriers. But even for white women, the fact they're going out and doing this is huge. And we really are never going to be able to fully comprehend the magnitude of what they took on to do that. Because, like I said, they were totally dependent on men. Even the women doing the work were dependent on men for the income, right, to allow them to do the work. So, if Patty Rutherford Jacobs' husband had said no, I think eventually we would have heard from Patty Rutherford Jacobs. Because we found out yesterday she actually is listed on the census. She filled out the census for her household and listed herself as like the head of household. And her husband's on there, but like it's under her name. So, I mean, I think she's doing her own thing, but if she's having to fight her husband, that takes her energy from being able to fight the cause. Now, Frances Griffin didn't have that, but Adela Hunt Logan is even having tension at home that's taken away some of her energy too. So it's hard for women to say it, but between husbands and families and male legislators and male voters, women were completely dependent on men to get the right to vote and to live in a lot of ways. And so they're up against a big system. We kind of joked today about the good old boy system. Mm-hmm. The good old boy system in 1920 or 2020 has nothing on the good old boy system of 1920 or 1900. So these are admirable women. They weren't perfect people. There's flaws in what they're doing, but you have to admire their gumption to do it, especially.
Seeing it as this milestone that it is and respecting that, but putting it in context.
Yeah.
I have one more question that we'd like to ask. So, are there any other Alabamian women who you did not get to speak on that you would like us to know about? So you want to give, is there anyone who you can think of that people could go do further research on or find out more? Because I know how hard it is to take, there's like hundreds of women and trying to find a few women that you can focus on and can kind of help you, guide you. But is there anyone else who you think someone should go look into if they're interested?
Yeah, well, so there's a ton of women in Selma. And actually I wrote a whole paper on the women in Selma, but if you want to get some more names of those women, there's an article in the Alabama Review, which is the journal of the Alabama Historical Association, and I list all those women from Selma, and it's the January 2020 issue, so it just came out. So that's an option if you want to learn more about those women. I know one of Alex's favorites is,
Yes.
Bossy, right?
Bossy O'Brien, yes.
Yeah, Bossy O'Brien Hundley. And I'll let you talk about her because I know she's your.
She is someone who I do find, she's a very interesting individual. Her name was actually Julia McBride O'Brien Hundley, but she went by her nickname Bossy, and she was a Birmingham suffragist who traveled. She's the one who went around her automobile to help get signatures for the 1915 petition, spoke to different local societies. She was the legislative chair, so she wrote these fabulous, like articles to the legislature about, hey, this is why you should do it. Women want their inheritance. And she debated Congressman Tom Heflin, and there's this wonderful scene. You can learn more about her on our website, alabamawomen100.org. And we also have her in our Portraits of Persistence virtual exhibit. We have a video up about her as well. So I find her to be such an interesting person. You can find that on our Alabama History at Home website. And so I find her to be incredibly interesting. And she is a real, just kind of like all these women that you've talked about. She's someone who kind of pushed the boundaries. She was married, all the stuff, but she from the beginning, like I think told her husband, I'm a women's rights activist and this is how it's going to be.
Her nickname's Bossy. You can't help but love a woman whose nickname is Bossy. So, and for the early part of the movement, there's a lady, her last name's Hildreth. She's up in North Alabama, and the Archives has her scrapbook actually digitized, and that's phenomenal. In the Dothan area, there's a lady named Scotty McKenzie Fraser, who's also a Judson alum. Yay, Judson! 1903. And Hayden McDaniel at the Archives is actually working on research on her. So that's the Dothan area. There's a lady in Mobile, Eugenie Marks, who's Jewish actually, and she's doing a lot of work in the Mobile area for suffrage. So the state's pretty well covered. Obviously, Birmingham has a lot also. And so if you're in a particular area and you want somebody kind of more local to your areas, find me on Facebook or send an email or something, contact us somehow, and I'll be glad to give you some more specific names of some people in various areas. But yeah, there were women around the state who weren't necessarily these leaders like Jacobs or Griffin, but they're doing a lot of they're the legwork, right? What for the civil rights movement would have been the foot soldiers. And so they're having to convince mom and grandmom, who are probably still wearing corsets at this point, and their hair all tidied up in buns to floor length skirts, to think about at least women going to the vote. And there had to be a lot of convincing, like I said, even for women. So the most famous anti-suffragist is Marie Bankhead Owen, right? Who's running a state agency, but when your father's the president of the Senate and your brother's Speaker of the House or something, you can afford to not have the vote. But most of us don't have that connection. So,
was the founder and director of a state agency. So
yeah, and then she became the director of a state agency. So, but she didn't think women needed to vote, and I have a feeling there's some classism probably in there. There were probably her friends she thought were okay to vote, but there might be some other people that she wasn't as excited about. So it's a fascinating movement, and people's reasons for getting involved are fascinating, and people's reasons for not wanting to vote are fascinating too. So it says a lot about the individuality of people, but a lot about class and race in Alabama at the time too.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Valerie, for joining us in this virtual presentation, and also for a nice little tidbit there to tease for next month that Marie Bankhead Owen, I'm sure she's going to be front and center in Ryan Blocker's talk, as well as with other anti-suffragists. So if you found this really interesting, join us next month so you can learn about the other side of the movement, those women who didn't want the right to vote. All right, well, thank y'all so much.
Thank y'all. Bye-bye.